How long my phone actually records for. Okay. These microphones work?
Testing.
Oh, yeah, that's good. Okay. When are you starting the time? Okay. Well, I wish I hadn't run, because now I'm out of breath. So, who am I? My name is Blake Tristan Wilde, and I always wanted to be a filmmaker. That obviously never panned out, primarily because it's just an expensive way to create things. Being a filmmaker means that you have to work with producers, you have to work with editors. You can't do it yourself unless you never want to see your movies be seen. So, when I was about 15 or so, that dream started dying away and was replaced by a hyperfixation and obsession on comic books. The comic books I got were just incredible. I never got into comics as a child, and I just immediately became obsessed. And that transferred my want to create a story, to storytell, into creating comics, from film to comics. Because with comics, you don't have a budget, you don't really need to involve anybody else in the process. You can if there's something in particular that you're not adequate at, but even then, that doesn't stop a lot of people. So with comics, the only budget is just your imagination. You can do anything in comics, and that's what I love about them. That's what I think is so incredible about this medium. And when I say comics, I'm not limiting that specifically to American comics. Manga has been rising in popularity. The panel right before me about anime. Anime is primarily based upon manga. It's such a just plethora of versatile storytelling that happens in these mediums. And it's really a beautiful way of creating and expressing yourself and telling stories. Storytelling is the oldest tradition in humankind. It goes back to cave paintings. What are cave paintings but rudimentary comic books? So, before I get started, I'm going to do a little advert. Again, Smokey's videos on YouTube if you are interested. I cover various comic books from the Silver Age to modern era. I also have a podcast called the Comic Shtick Podcast, which is a weekly little recap on comics, pop culture, everything like that, so check that out. And of course, DESTRUCTO BOY. First 3 issues of 5 are on sale now, $10 per issue or $25 for all 3. Check me out at my booth number 13 along that far wall. And so with that done, I'm going to get into the history of comics. So who here reads comics? Raise your hand. Who is a longtime reader of comics, I should say? Who is familiar with the general eras of comics, such as Silver Age, Bronze Age, Golden Age? Okay, you know what I'm talking about. So, the beautiful thing about comics is that it's only about 100 years old in terms of what we think of as comics. And that came around in what is called around the Platinum Age to the Golden Age. That's early 1900s to the 1940s. Platinum Age was some genius, who I cannot remember the name of, came up with the idea of collecting comic strips from the local newspapers and compiling them into books. That grew into the comic as we know it now, in the Golden Age. The Golden Age of comics is just incredible. It's where you get the first appearance of Superman. It's where you get the first appearance of Batman. It's where you get the original Green Lantern, who wore all red and had very little green on his costume. The original Flash, who had the Mercury helmet with the wings. It's fantastic. But the sad thing is that, well, it's not exactly sad, but the other thing is that wasn't the only thing. A lot of people think now comics, the most popular one is superhero books. But that is because in the about late 40s, early 50s, there were Senate congressional hearings to do with horror magazines and horror books. These comics were being written as, horror stories. So some things you might see on the covers would be, a decapitated head being held aloft and blood dripping down, or somebody being violently murdered. Now, there's this man called Frederick Wortham, and he is hated in the comic book community, as you in the back row can attest. Frederick Wertham wrote Seduction of the Innocent, and Seduction of the Innocent was everything that destroyed comics at that time. But I personally do not think that this was a bad thing. I think that Seduction of the Innocent, which said that things such as Batman and Robin were in a homosexual relationship, or comics were making kids act out or be violent or anything like that, if you look back in history, it's the same thing each generation. Rock and roll did the same thing eventually. Video games did. So anyway, what happened after Seduction of the Innocent was written, people would burn comic books. They would take them from their children and burn them. They would toss them in the garbage. That's why there aren't many from that era left. And going back to the Senate congressional hearings, that enacted something called the Comics Code Authority. Who here has seen Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse? So if you remember at the beginning of that film, before it starts, there is a big block of white that says, approved by the Comics Code Authority. That was installed to essentially save everybody's jobs. It was a self-policing in a way. Any comic that had the Comics Code Authority stamped on the cover meant that it was good for your child. So obviously everybody would work towards that. With that, they installed a lot of limitations. You couldn't have Wolfman in the book. You couldn't have zombies. You couldn't have police officers being, bribed by criminals, because that showed that they weren't upstanding citizens. So what the Comics Code Authority did, in a way, is neuter comics on a whole. But I personally think that it is the most revolutionary take for comics to have. Because after this, superhero comics died. There were no superhero comics after World War II in the mid-50s. It just plummeted. Until about, 1957 to 63, I can't remember the exact date, of the first appearance of Barry Allen the Flash. And that is said to have reigned in the Silver Age. The Silver Age of comics. If you look up funny Batman comic, you'll bound to find these silly old panels of Joker saying, haha, he sure has a boner, because, boner meant a mistake. Things like that. Rainbow Batman, Zebra Batman, all these crazy takes on Batman. Yes, do you have a question?
They were also the comics that helped define Batman 66.
Yes, correct. So the Silver Age of comics, one of their main influences is the 1966 Adam West Batman series. From the Bams and Pals, like we see along the walls littered back there, to just the overall sort of campy, childish take upon the books itself. Again, because they were being limited by the Comics Code Authority, they would have to be limited to being able to be read by children. Which meant that the stories had to get inventive. No longer was Batman fighting a mobster, or the Joker if he ever showed up, because he rarely did. He was fighting aliens from Neptune. He was fighting a sea dragon, anything. There's a great series called Superman's pal Jimmy Olsen, which is my favorite comic of all time. And that detailed just outrageous stories from the Silver Age. Jimmy Olsen had to fight tiny Supermen from a bottled city of Kandor. Superman himself, during this time, he could do anything. He could do anything so much that he had the power to extend his hand out, and a tiny 6-inch version of himself would fly out of the palm of his hand, suit included somehow. I don't know where he made that from. And he had all the powers of Superman. So that's what we were dealing with in the 60s. Eventually, comics started to mature. They still didn't get away with what they did in the 40s and 30s, but they were finding ways to tell more adult-leaning stories in the realm of the Comics Code. So that leads us into the 70s, and that is the Bronze Age. So the Bronze Age is depicted by the Joker being brought back to his evil criminal route, his origins rather. Because in the 60s, he's just the Cesar Romero Joker from the 66 show. He's a lovable prankster who never really does anything bad, aside from an elaborate scheme to steal the giant penny away from Batman or something. And in the 70s, he murdered people. That leads us into the 80s. And now the 80s is where comics really, the most defining era of comics since the Comics Code was enforced. And that is in the late 80s. In 1986, two major series were released. The first is The Dark Knight Returns, written by and illustrated by Frank Miller. The second is Watchmen. Is anybody familiar with either of those?
Yeah.
So, they're very adult tales. Frank Miller's The Dark Knight Returns created a whole new idea of who Batman was, returning to his Dark Crusader origins. I actually have a whole hour and a half long sort of discussion about it on my YouTube channel if you're interested, about Frank Miller's entire Batman works. Because as Frank Miller goes on, he gets really crazy. But I think it's all genius. So Batman, The Dark Knight Returns, and Watchmen led to a whole new darkness to take over the comic book reign. Superheroes started cracking skulls and not even bothering to ask questions about who this criminal is or what crime they're trying to solve. And that is where Image Comics comes into play. Image Comics loved, the creators of Image Comics, the founders, they were the disciples of Frank Miller. They did the ultra-violence to the extreme with none of the amazing writing that Frank Miller had. They focused primarily on visuals. Who would have thought when the company was called Image? So that's where comics were in the 90s. In the 90s, comics were extreme. Comics were badass. They were cracking backs. There's even a specific character called Silverhawk, or Darkhawk, I can't remember, I get them mixed up, who his whole fight set was to break someone's spine and then run away. To just tell you again where comics were at that time of the edginess, he also had AIDS. So it still had the Comics Code Authority logo on it, if you're wondering. So at this time, the Comics Code Authority really meant absolutely nothing. It was just a self-policing. Yes, again.
Some comic companies even left the code in favor of using their own fee trading system.
Yeah, that's true. A lot of indie publishers, small press, they didn't bother with it because they didn't have to worry. Marvel Comics wouldn't stop using it until 2000, 2001 with X-Force 116, 113. DC Comics, a couple years later, they held on to it for a long time. The company that did hold on to it for the longest time was Archie. Archie Comics. They had it until like 2012, I think, and then they just decided to get rid of it, even though they're still publishing the same kind of stuff. But comics in the 90s almost did not make it to where we are today. And that is because of something called the speculator market. The speculator market is something I hate and will go against a tirade, going to tirade against. If you walk out here and you are looking around and you see comics that are encased in big plastic containers with little writing on the top that says 9.8, 9.4, 3.5, and exorbitant amount of pricing on it, that is a new speculator market that we're in. In the 90s, it was people thinking that they could buy an issue 1 of Kick-Asser. I don't know, it's just some fake name. Just some random comic. And it would be worth their kid's college fund. Obviously, that didn't work because now you can go find any of those comics in a dollar bin or cheaper. So the comics community crashed. And then they came slowly chugging back after Marvel filed for bankruptcy and got bought out by a toy company, and then got bought out again, then got bought out by Disney, to where we are today. And where we are today, I believe, would have never happened if the Comics Code Authority was not enacted. Because, think about it, if we don't have the Comics Code Authority, then about 30 to 40 years later, we don't have Frank Miller and Alan Moore writing their magnum opus against the kind of censorship that is happening, which leads into there being no reason for the Image founders to come around and fight against their own censorship of not being paid well enough, not being paid royalties for the characters we created by Marvel and DC. And if we never get Image, then the indie comics never blow up like they did in the 90s and early 2000s. We don't get amazing writers like Brian Michael Bendis, who was just the chief creative control in the early 2000s for Marvel. So comics has a long and tumultuous history, as you can tell. And if anybody says comics are dying, don't believe them, because people have been saying that comics are dying since comics were invented. And that is a brief as I could make it, a history of comics. Does anybody have any questions before I move on to the next general topic? Yes?
Yeah, things like the comics code, was that voluntary or?
Yes, but if you didn't have it, you weren't going to be able to sell your books in the corner store, the gas station, the shopping market, because this was at a time when you think about where do you buy comics now? Where do you go? Comic book stores, comic conventions. Before 80s or so, late 70s, before the direct market, you could get comics at 7-Eleven. 7-Eleven, I'm glad you brought that up, had their own special comics made by Marvel, which were about this big and contained like some sort of original stories, sometimes reprints. But you could go into any gas station and buy comics. You could go into Kmart and buy comics. You could just really go anywhere that wasn't a comic book shop. Comic book stores were kind of a bad thing for comic books in general, just because it limited that market. So, now less people have access to them. It creates that sense of, oh my gosh, I need to read 1,800 issues before I get to this issue, yada, yada, yada. Does anybody else have a question?
What about Beetle Bailey and those kinds?
So Beetle Bailey, I'm not too familiar with its history. I don't know who published that, but Beetle Bailey, it's part comic, part newspaper strip, and I do believe they would have digests and everything, sort of on a similar vein to Archie.
Yes, like Archie and all that.
Yeah, so, they never had an issue. Beetle Bailey wasn't cracking people's skulls or anything in the 90s. I do love Beetle Bailey. As a child, I loved newspaper comic strips, Beetle Bailey.
Yeah, Sunday.
Garfield to an extent. I think Beetle Bailey was my favorite,
The
though.
Sunday comics are not funny anymore. They're just dumb.
I don't
They
believe
put
it.
all advertising for deaf people or, all those things, hearing aids.
Yeah,
They
comic,
don't even put funny things on there.
I think it's partially because, at a time you can only really get comics either through the companies or, hey, newspaper strips. I can do a weekly newspaper strip, daily newspaper strip. People are going to see me. It gets syndicated across city after city. Half the country sees it. I get paid well. But with the advent of the internet and more independent works, I feel that there's less reason to just not do it yourself, which brings me into my next topic, which is creating comics. Like I said earlier, you can do anything in comics. Your wildest ideas you can do. But I think that ideas are a creator's worst enemy. So has anybody here, you've ever written a story that you want to get? Yes, thank you. You'll know that, possibly, that you have all these ideas. You go, oh my gosh, I have this great idea for a story. Let me write that down in my notes. Maybe this could happen. Maybe that could happen. And it gets to a point where it's just a treadmill of ideas. You're running, but you're not getting anywhere. And that's why I think that ideas like that are just a big roadblock. You need to obviously have a good idea, but you can't let the idea portion of your work take up all your time. At a certain point, you have to realize that you must limit yourself. Of course, when you come back to it, you can rework things as you're going through it. But in general, what I've seen is that ideas are really the mainstay. Like, how many people, have you ever heard of somebody like, oh yeah, I'm working on a novel. I go down to Starbucks every other week and I write my great American novel. It never comes out, but I got a lot of ideas for it. I was in correspondence with someone online who, knew I was self-publishing, making my own comics and everything. And they're like, hey, can I get some advice, blah, blah, blah. So I was like, yeah, sure, what you got? And they were making, I can't remember what it was. I think it was some sort of like fan fiction, Marvel universe sort of thing. Fan fiction is a whole nother tirade of mine. I don't think it's the best. I think you should focus on creating your own properties rather than just using someone else. Yes?
For some of my writing, I started with fan fiction ideas, and then I slowly started retooling them.
Yes,
into original characters.
Yeah, I think that's great. My main issue is just the people who don't get to that part, who just continue writing like Harry Potter fanfiction part 28, stuff like that. But yeah, I think that fanfiction is a good stepping stone, but you just have to move past that. But anyway, this person, they would send me They wouldn't send me art that they were drawing of this story they were making. They wouldn't send me the scripts that they were making. Instead, they would send me just insanely detailed notes and catalogs and journals and immaculately researched like how this power armor would work in the real world. It would have to be nuclear energy, which means that to be encompassed in a suit, it would have to be built like this, blah, blah, blah. And they would have like references in the notes to like what they were researching. And that just kept going on and on. And it was about maybe a month and a half, 2 months, I was talking to this person. In that 2 months that I met them online, created correspondence, they were sending me all this stuff. Not once did I see them actually write a story. It was just, like I said, the treadmill of ideas had them trapped. He was chained to that thing by the neck and could not get off. So eventually I just had to, stop providing my thoughts and everything on that. Just because I realized this person, it's just never going to happen. They're never going to be able to reach that pocket and break free from that idea stage. Any questions? Anything? Any statements anybody wants to make? Okay. Making comics. So all I have to say is just make comics. If you want to make comics, if you want to storytell, if you want to make manga, anything, just do it. You can do it in a notebook. You can do it in a sketchbook. You can write it by hand. You don't have to. There's no rules or regulations or guidelines. There's no comics code you have to worry about, especially if you're doing it yourself. Yes?
When I write comics, I would write a bunch of ideas and things that can't possibly be turned into a comic. And I would just edit through them and just write around it to make something that could be realized as such.
That's a good way to do it. Yeah, just check off what you want and don't want, essentially. But yeah, you can do anything with comics. You can post them online. You can post them on Instagram, social media, anything, TikTok. You can go, hey, I'm making a comic, and then make the video. I don't use TikTok. That's the social media where I fall off and don't catch up with everybody else. You can self-publish, which is what I'm doing. Self-publishing involves either printing it yourself, selling it online, or creating some sort of distribution network, contacting people yourself, doing it that way. There's mini comics. Mini comics is this, but small. You can do them on a 8.5 by 11 piece of paper if you want to. You just cut it down the line, make it into a grid, fold it up, staple it, pass it around, photocopy it, whatever. You can do that. Mini comics is a whole other genre of comics in and of itself. You can find it anywhere online. Etsy has tons of mini comics, all about just the craziest things, the most mundane things. It can be anything. There's a new website, Substack, if you're unfamiliar with that. There's Substack. It's sort of similar if you've ever heard of Patreon, where you pay a fee every month, and it's sort of like a monthly newsletter or however often they want to make it. But you would pay and have a subscriber base. You can post them onto there if you want to make it sort of exclusive. You can share anything free that you'd like to advertise. There's Webtoons. I've personally never used Webtoons. I'm not too familiar with it, but I do know that a lot of people in the current indie stage and platforms, they did get their start on Webtoons, which is an online, comic hosting website. You can do it like weekly strips or something along those lines. There's been a couple who have even gone to work on DC and Marvel issues. Do what I did, enter contests. 2 years ago, I entered a local contest that was being held to create from a blank 60-page booklet to create a story. So I wrote and illustrated and lettered 3 short stories in under a month because that was the deadline for some reason. And I ended up winning, and they published it. All the proceeds I kept with them as credit to then fund as capital for this series. And Destructo Boy was the original, the main character essentially of the original book. And he was the one that picked up and grew up the most. Most people liked him, so I continued with that. Just advocate for yourself. Use the internet to do this. Don't let people say, oh, you want to be an artist? Oh boy, Don't let people just go, oh, hey, yeah, I bet you're, what are you going to do next? Get an art degree and work as a barista? Haha. I'm so original. Don't let people get under your skin. Don't let them deter you from doing what you want to do. Don't let them deter you from creating. Don't let them deter you from expressing yourself. Do what makes you you. And you can do that by making comics. But yeah, again, advocate for yourself. Don't just sit there and be like, oh, nobody's looking at this. Post it around, share it. Just do anything you can to just get your name out there. And yeah, like I said, just use the internet, because we are living in the best era to not just make comics, but to make any art. You could, like I said, any social media platform. There's the new one is TikTok. There are time lapses of people making just immaculate portraits. You can just do anything. You don't have to worry about, oh, I got to go to Kinko's and then print these up. If you don't know what Kinko's is, it was an old copy and print store. I got to print these up. I got to worry about getting this funded and getting this funded, because you can just do it all online essentially for free. So really, like I said, I keep saying this because it's true. Comics can be and look like anything. The general public tends to think of comics as superheroes. They tend to think of them as what they are, as being led by giant corporations like Marvel and DC. But like I said, there's so much more that's there. There's so much more that you can really do with this method of storytelling, with this medium. So if you want to get into comics or anyway, don't think, oh, nobody's going to want to read this slice of life story about a gay mechanic who wants to operate a fishing boat. Because there's going to be an audience, there's going to be companies that you can submit those to that specifically do not bother with the superhero stuff or the sci-fi stuff. There's a company called Fantagraphics. They focus on like autobiographical and slice of life stuff like that. So again, you can do anything. What's my time looking like?
I will give you about 21 minutes.
Okay, thank God. Don't be too proud to work on improving your skill as well. I know it's hard to, take criticism, especially when it's not constructive. Most of the criticism I get online whenever I post any of my art is, this looks bad, you shouldn't even try. Things along those lines. And that is another example of don't let people deter you, because they're writing that online, and I'm currently giving a speech about how great comics are to a group of people who seem to be listening. But if you don't work on improving yourself and your ability, then that means that you're limiting yourself and your work, your product. My arts, last year, if you were here, it was nothing like what I'm doing right now. I've changed my art style because if anybody's familiar with the artist Jack Kirby, he's the king of comics, as he was dubbed. He's a creative force, tour de force of creativity. I was more inspired by him last year. And that's, for the past couple of years, that's been my artistic inspiration. But once I started switching over to a new style, not in here, but on some of my other things, as you can see if you stop by my booth, I started getting better reception. I still got the people who would, like downvoted or say, oh, this is a little rough, good job, you're getting there, stuff like that. But overall, changing how I drew, I'm now using more extensive photo reference, which is attested as being a great method by one of the greatest comic book artists, Neil Adams. I've seen a better feedback from changing the art style and adapting and improving my work. Again, also, if you don't want to if you think using reference or photo reference is evil or bad or something, don't think that, because that's a tool. It's just another tool. Same as your pen, same as your pencil, same as your stylus if you're doing it digitally. Another tool is something that is very new, is AI-generated art. I am working on a comic book series, it's going to be 6 issues, entitled The Custodians, Agents of Cross. It asks the question, What if the only heroes that can save the world was an intelligent baboon, the world's smartest man who only has the power of elasticity in his right arm, a teenage girl who can control fire, and a four-armed werewolf? And I discovered this great thing called AI-generated art. You type in a prompt, whatever you want it to be, type in comic convention panel, and it'll make something from just lists of images that this computer is generating. And it doesn't look good. It doesn't look very real. It doesn't look realistic. It looks like a German expressionist film. And people are, they're shitting on that, pardon my language. But I see it as just another way to use photo reference. You're putting in exactly what you want to find, and then you're using that for yourself. So how's that any different than buying a book that has, different expressions, or going to Google Images? So finally, at the end of this first, how much do I got left? 15? Okay. So I'm going to wrap up my comic discussion with this. And this is a quote from the great television series, The Twilight Zone. There is a fifth dimension beyond that which is known to man. It is a dimension as vast as space and timeless as infinity. It is the middle ground between light and shadow, between science and superstition. And it lies between the pit of man's fears and the summit of his knowledge. This is the dimension of imagination. You can imagine anything inside your brain. Somehow it's just a 5-pound hunk of meat, but somehow it can have endless expanses of infinity and just crazy ideas. And you can mine for that and use it in your comics. So now I'm going to move on. If you have seen the topic or the name of this panel, this is where it's going to start getting a little weird and esoteric. It's called The Magic of Comics. Magic spelled with a K at the end. I was hoping to trick people into thinking that it had to do with Magic of the Gathering. Did it work? It's actually about something that I got into a couple years ago called Chaos Magick. Chaos Magick, as it is been led to believe, is enforcing your will upon the universe via creating sigils. It's an artistic method of expression that seemingly works. I've done it. I truly believe that it is something real. It's no real different than any other system of belief in the world. What is it? In the most lightest of terms, it's essentially you create a sigil. A sigil is a little artistic piece that you put, it is my will that it will rain tomorrow. Something along those lines. It is my will that I'll find a piece of money on the ground. You write that. And then you get rid of all the vowels in the sentence. And then you go through and get rid of all the repeating letters. And what you have left is a gobbledygook mush of just random assorted letters. And this is where the best part of it comes in. You then take that and artistically transform it into something alien until it doesn't look like letters. So the T becomes a squiggle here, and you make it look indecipherable and unhuman. And then you charge it. And that is done by putting it somewhere, forgetting its intent. So I want it to rain tomorrow. I'll write that down, get rid of the vowels, get rid of the extra letters, and then I'll put it away until I find it some other time. Then you charge it, which can be done in a variety of ways, which I will not talk about now because there are children in the room. And then you just rip it up, you throw it to the wind, toss it in the water, burn it, whatever. And that releases your will upon the universe. And I know I sound crazy for this. What do you expect from a guy wearing a paisley print shirt? But I really, truly think it works because about 3 years ago, I made a sigil that said, I want to be a comic book author, creator, and publisher and have an audience that enjoys my work. And here I am 3 years later. Obviously, it has to be something that you can do. It can't be, I want to go to the sun and swim in its flames. I want to be the first human to go to Mars. It has to be something seemingly reasonable that you could, expand your influence on the world. But that is something I truly believe aided me. Could it be a placebo? Yes. But is it a placebo that works? Yes. Other examples. I said it is my will to see a bald woman in a dress. I was like, okay, this is crazy. This was when I was first getting into it. This will never happen. Bald woman in a dress? Who'd think of it? And the next couple days I was waiting, and 3 days later, seems to come in threes, 3 days, 3 months, 3 years. I'm scrolling through Instagram and I see a woman, a bald woman, wearing a dress, dressed like 11 from Stranger Things. And I'm like, oh my God, it works. So finally, I made a sigil that said, it is my will, that's how I do it, you can do it however you like. It is my will to find a loving and lasting relationship. And I made that, got rid of the extra letters, got rid of the vowels, and tossed it away. I usually just flush it down the toilet. I'm very unceremonial about the whole process. But that seems to work. And about 2 months later, I met this girl. Met her through an online app, Tinder or something. And we were talking, getting to know each other and everything. And it didn't pan out. So I was like, well, crap, I guess sigil magic, chaos magic doesn't really work. I guess it was all happenstance. And then a month later, I met the woman who I'm now married to. And that was 4 years ago today that we met. So I truly do believe that if everyone here goes home and creates a sigil of what they want to have happen, then we could change the world with it. It's the new counterculture. It's just it's just another method of expressing yourself at the most basic level. Even if you feel it'll never happen, there will still be a part of you inside here or inside this crazy thing we call a brain that will influence you to work harder, to pursue these new opportunities, to create a life for yourself, a new world for you to inhabit. And that is all I got. That is the end of the panel, I think. Thank you.
Yeah.
Anybody have any questions before I go? Anything?
Very encouraging.
Thank you. I'm glad.
Made some fan art of you on the fly.
Oh, thank you.
Wow.
I really want that. So thank you again for
Took a
coming.
few pictures of it.
Oh, yeah. I'm going to head over there right now.